I would like to introduce Myra Ryan, who would like to say a little welcome from the CNG.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever CNG virtual events. We pride ourselves on creating opportunities for credentialing professionals to network with each other face to face. So it was a very big step for us to shift to holding a virtual event. Of course, our more important commitment is to providing a safe avenue for professionals to exchange information. As we become more familiar with online event hosting, we hope to provide meaningful ways to network virtually. We're really thrilled with the enthusiasm you've shown in registering for this event, and we're very sorry we couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to join us today. We thought we had plenty of seats, going with something like 3 times what our usual in-person participation is, and yet, we still had to have a waiting list and couldn't accommodate everyone. As Erin mentioned, we are recording this session, and we'll make the recording available on the CNG website for our colleagues who aren't able to join us live this morning. A huge is due to our program committees and several of our board members for their work to plan the event in the new format. It involved everything from acquiring a WebEx license to holding practice sessions, and of course, lining up a great panel of speakers. I'm going to turn things back over to Erin to say a few words of thanks to our sponsor.
Thank you, Myra. So we want to thank our sponsors. We have several of them. Here are full sponsors. Everyone has been fantastic. Whether you've been to a meeting before, if this is your first time, all these people are great to work with. We have our supporting sponsors, and our main sponsor this week is, went the wrong way, sorry, is BTL. And I'm trying, Abby, I want to make sure Abby from BTL is going to say a couple words as a thank you. Abby, can you hear me? You want to speak? Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back to be involved with CNG. Though I do wish I...
Abby, if you could speak a little louder.
Oh, okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Probably most of you out there know me since I've been in the testing industry in various roles for 20 years now. But for those who don't know me, I'm Abby Eston, and I'm at Surpass. If you don't know much about Surpass or our platform, I'd love to chat with you further in our capabilities. But in a nutshell, we're a global provider of assessment services and technology. We have a simple mission to improve the assessment experience for everyone. The culture of our company is to listen to the needs of certification bodies so we can refine our technology to better meet the needs of the industry. And it's because of that emphasis on listening to our clients and prospects that our people, our business, and our assessment technology is regulated. Various international. An example of that, we were most recently awarded for Enterprise. That specific award was for excellence in international. The Queen's Awards are the most prestigious business. Also here in the U.S., we were American Business Award.
Abby, if you can lean forward a little bit, it's still a little far away.
Okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
We're headquartered in West Yorkshire in the UK, and we have a US office in suburban Philadelphia as well, from where we service our North American clients. One of the key highlights of our organization is our focus on why we're particularly excited to be sponsoring CNG, which in itself is a great community within the test. It really bears repeating how focused we are on community. And so our prospects and our clients join our ever-growing Surpass community to share their expertise and their knowledge. We regularly put out podcasts and webinars, culminates in a yearly Surpass community in-person conference, which of course this year will sadly not. But we do have some exciting things being. If you don't already follow our Surpass community, I encourage you to go to surpass.com/follow to make sure you're in tune with the. And one last thing before I finish up, I want to draw your attention to another resource you might be interested in checking out. At Surpass, we're the supporters of a new event taking place in the global assessment called the International Test Leaders Forum. This forum is going to bridge a global audience to discuss issues and developments that are common in the industry regardless of geography, particularly in the so it's a free event. I think it'll be fantastic, and you can register and find out more by visiting itlforum.com. Again, that's internationalforum.com. So please do feel free to reach out to me at abby.eston@surpass.com. I'd love to chat with you about anything. And thanks again for allowing us to be the sponsor.
If you don't mind, if you could send me some of that information, because it kind of came in and out, that way I can share it with the group and we can make sure that they could sign up for stuff. I can do that.
Absolutely. Sounds good.
Great. Thank you. Well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start introducing our speakers. Our today's lovely moderator is Christine Nero, which I'm sure many of you know. She will be leading the conversation for our 4 speakers. Today's speakers, we have Trish McConkey and Jessica. Jessica, I don't even want to butcher your last name, so I'm going to let you describe how to say it. They will be speaking for the first session. And then we have John Schell and then David Kushner, who they will be speaking on 2 different things. So just a quick reminder, if you guys can make sure that you are on mute and that your camera is disabled from those things and make it a little easier. We just want to make sure that the speakers and anyone who's supposed to be talking can be heard. If you have any issues, please reach out to me. And then Christine and speakers, just make sure you speak clearly, loudly, so we can all hear. I'm going to hand it over to Christine.
Okay. Well, Erin, thank you so much for all of your work and helping us get organized to present our first ever CNG virtual webinar meeting. And I would like to thank CNG for managing during disruption. No coincidence, this is our topic, in converting our face-to-face meetings to this webinar format. They did it with great care and with great speed. And so we are delighted to be able to continue these really important sessions. I wish to welcome our participants. I mean, we registered as full, which is like a first time. So we are grateful that you're able to commit your time to this meeting. And we're really hoping for, in the very near future, more face-to-face so we can see everybody and welcome everybody. I'd also like to welcome our panelists. And I'll tell you, our panelists have worked really hard to pull together this session. We started planning this, I think in, very early April through our Chicago CNG program committee. And in the time that we had envisioned our first content for this session to now, it has changed. It has changed from managing in sort of a crisis management format through what we're doing, what we've done, and how we're innovating. So our panelists have been incredibly flexible and have been able to move at the same speed and with the same amount of uncertainty as the virus. So I want to really thank our panelists for being so flexible. I'm joined on this call, and I'd like to introduce Jen Weed. You're going to hear me throughout the session say, Jen, what are the audience questions? And Jen is managing all of the questions for me so I can moderate. So that's who I'm going to be talking to, is lovely Jen Weed. And I think I'm also joined by Linda Anguish from the NCCA Accreditation Standard and Dr. Reed Castle. And I will be available as resources for the ISO IEC 17024 accreditation standard. In case any of your questions have to do with accreditation, we brought those resources on board for you as well. So I'm going to take a minute to talk about the format of our session. So in our work in putting this together, we selected 3 topics for today. And the topics include eligibility and certification requirements. That's topic number 1. Maintenance of certification, which is topic number 2. And governance and leadership, which is topic number 3. And I've asked our presenters to each take a topic. So topic number 1, we will have Trish and Jessica from Intelios present on. Topic number 2, John from the American Roofers Contractors Association, and topic number 3 from our consultant, David Kushner. Now, I'll tell you, I've worked with these folks for a few weeks, more than a few weeks, putting this together, and I can tell you, they will not just be the only ones talking about these topics, okay? So we're going to have the topic leaders start with a 10-minute overview of how they handled these specific topics during this pandemic, and the other presenters will add what they need to add to the conversation, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. So as they are presenting, if you have a question, type it in the chat box and get it to Jen. We have about 25 minutes allotted per topic. And then at the end, we have some more time for any other questions of a general nature or a specific nature for that matter that may come through. So at this point, and I will say ahead of schedule here, I am going to ask Trish and Jessica to present how they have been handling eligibility and certain certification requirements at Intelios and what they've done that's innovative. So Trish and Jessica, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Through my face mask. While this is a joke, it looks like it just may be the way of the future. My name is Trish McConkey, and I'm the Director of Certification. I'm presenting with my colleague, Jessica Herkenroder. We both work for Intelios, which is a nonprofit medical imaging certification organization. We certify sonographers, vascular technologists, physicians, and other medical professionals in imaging modalities, including sonography, computed tomography, nuclear cardiology, and magnetic resonance. We also recently required our first non-imaging certification, which is in vascular medicine. I'm excited to tell you what our teams have been doing over the past few months in reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. Life as we knew it has changed for us and for those we serve. We're here to discuss what our teams have been focused on, including how we've accelerated our way of thinking to better serve our constituents, adapting our rules and policies, as well as ways we plan to innovate for the future. Our constituents' needs have changed, thus we have fundamentally changed how we serve. For instance, some individuals are in hospitals on COVID floors right dead smack in the middle of it all, while others have been furloughed or had their hours cut. Very early on, our leadership worked with our test vendor to have our exams deemed essential. Imaging can be used in the diagnosis and treatment of COVID. Therefore, without certified individuals, it would greatly impact patient care. With our exams being deemed essential, it meant that we only lost about 2 weeks of the in-person testing for our candidates. While we lost those 2 weeks of in-person testing, we never stopped accepting applications, though actually some of our competitors did. The fact that a year ago we had instituted an all paperless application submission process helped us to move forward without any delay. Though with that said, due to COVID, we did make some paper forms into electronic forms and digitally filled forms. In order to change so many of our policies and procedures, we have had to accelerate the way we think, rapidly responding to unprecedented requests from our constituents in new and alternative ways. Our organization has responded and adapted to constant change with positivity and resilience like no other. One of our biggest changes was moving our customer care team from 100% in-office work to 100% remote work within about a week's time, and that was no small undertaking. Test vendor management is another great example of the team's need to accelerate and adapt. We've worked with our test vendor Pearson VUE on implementing new policies, such as accepting expired IDs while the courts and motor vehicle administrations are closed, and also working to inform our candidates of new social distancing rules, sanitation measures, capacity limitations, and face mask requirements for their very own safety. We have learned so much from this pandemic that will influence our policies and innovations moving forward. For instance, having our exams offered in brick and mortar test centers has been a challenge for our organization during the pandemic. This is driving Intelios to investigate new possibilities such as remote proctoring, moving away from single exam administrations, and other alternatives. In regard to adapting our rules and policies, this is an ongoing process, one that may never end. One of the ways that we have responded is by extending deadlines from application windows to exam administration windows to eligibility periods. All As with all of our programs, we are monitoring the situation and adjusting on the fly, with proper approvals, of course, to meet our changing customer needs. Fellows, residents, students, and educational programs have been greatly impacted by the COVID pandemic. Many have gone from a classroom to a virtual learning opportunity in a short period of time. There have been closed clinical sites, changes to curriculums, and graduation delays for many programs. We are continuously monitoring what is happening within the programs and accreditation agencies and adjusting our policies and procedures accordingly. We are also launching a series of virtual focus groups or educator listening tours to learn more about their struggles, and together we hope to find ways to address their needs. We are witnessing the evolution of the medical field, thus Intellios will need to evolve with it or even better lead some of that innovation. Telemedicine, simulation, changes in medical practice, and education are all areas where we are seeing innovative opportunities. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jessica.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Jessica Herkenroder, and I'm the Director of Engagement at Intellios. I'm going to build on what Trish just spoke about and touch upon a few additional areas where considerations were made due to COVID. So in the area of awarding certifications, most of the forms of verification for our certificates were not affected. So this includes the online directory, digital badges we award for examinations and credentials, which are processed by Credly, our third-party vendor. And both our temporary and permanent ID cards, these have all been available without interruption. The area of awarding certifications that require the most consideration has been printed certificates. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. With no access to the office, we haven't been able to print and mail certificates. So for a short-term solution, we've reached out to certificants by email just to let them know what's going on and what to expect in terms of a delay. And then also our long-term solution, we've taken steps in discussing digital certificates, which can be printed by certificants on demand through their personal login portal. In the area of maintenance of certification, we have two major programs that run annually. So the CME audit and then renewals. I'm sure you're familiar with one or both of them. Our audit typically launches in March and ends in April. So basically right in the middle of the pandemic, ramping up in the DC area. After review and consideration, we were approved to launch the audit a month late and then extend the due date. It should be noted that all changes to the programs that we have had to be carefully thought out, submitted to appropriate C-suite members for initial approval, and then of course sent up to the council leadership for final approval. Currently, we're in the process for renewals right now of discussing the different options and then preparing the recommendation for leadership. That leads me to my next point, which pertains to our organizational accreditation, which is ANSI. One of the considerations we've dealt with in terms of our accreditation is ensuring everything is documented. This includes carefully documenting all the temporary changes that Trish just spoke about, the changes that I mentioned regarding the CME audit and the renewals, and of course, any other temporary changes we made as a result of COVID-19. It also includes documenting permanent changes to policies and procedures. An example of one of our permanent changes was requesting a resolution to allow staff, with support of the councils, of course, to make adjustments for our constituents so that we can meet their needs during COVID-19. Next, I wanted to touch briefly upon volunteer management, something I'm sure, of course, many of you are familiar with. Given that we have curtailed all in-person volunteer meetings, we've had to transition to virtual meetings, which of course includes exam content development. In fact, we just completed our first fully online exam standard setting last Friday. Very excited. We're continually learning how to improve upon the online process, streamlining what does and what does not work. A few final areas include exhibits. So we're beginning to participate in virtually as exhibitors, rather than in person, since many shows are moving to the virtual platform. And then finally, communication. Hands down, in my opinion, the most important aspect of managing our programs in light of the pandemic is ongoing communication. There can never be enough. This includes internal communication from our CEO, Dale Sear, who shares regular organization-wide emails and also holds Q&A Zoom calls for staff to attend. So he ensures that staff are staying connected and updated on what's going on within the organization and how the organization is responding to what's happening. And then, of course, external communication. All the changes Trish and I have mentioned had to be clearly communicated to our constituents in a timely manner. Sometimes multiple communications about the same topic were required because of the ongoing changes, changes on the fly. And then along with emails, website, and social media updates, we created a COVID-19 discussion group in one of our Facebook groups. It has proven very successful with almost 10,000 members since it launched in March. It offers the community a place to not only learn from our organization, how we're responding, but also a place for them to share with each other information and to learn from each other. It certainly has taken a village to accomplish what we have in such a short time.
Okay, well, thank you, Trish, and thank you, Jessica. Jen, what questions came through from the audience?
Yeah. Hi, Christine. We've got a few things, and both thank you very much. It's clear this is not your first webinar radio. You are lovely presenters, so thank you for that. You mentioned having to extend deadlines, which I think we all did, and some of it felt very much on the fly, right? Like, this is only going to last 30 days, so I'll do a 30-day extension. How did you define how much time period you were going to give extensions for? Is it set, or is that still rolling as well?
That actually, I mean, it is definitely still rolling. In fact, with regards to the CME audit, we met and decided that we would start it a month late with the option to, reassess at the beginning of April, just to see where we were, because, it is ongoing and changing. So, yeah, there are no set dates in terms of how long we're supposed to give for extensions. We're just looking at the events around us, seeing how our registrants and certificants are handling it. We do follow the discussions that are going on in that COVID-19 discussion group to gauge what's going on with our constituents, seeing how they're handling it. And really it's on the fly, and we just thoughtful conversation about that.
Okay. You mentioned, you would come up with a plan, you would vet it with your C-suite, and then on up into your council. Have you received any pushback from your council leadership on some of the ideas that you've wanted to put forward?
Not that I'm aware of. So the council, it's actually pushed up from the C-suite up to the council. So I'm not aware of any pushback that we've gotten. In fact, from my understanding, we've had a lot of great support from the council members in terms of what our recommendation is. Since it is coming from thoughtful conversation from members of every department, or just about every department, we haven't really had much pushback, even from senior leadership. A couple questions about some of the recommendations, but they've been very supportive, I'd say, overall.
I think I can add to that a little bit as well. One of the things that Dale, our CEO, did right from the get-go is he actually sought board approval for the councils to make on-the-fly decisions and for us to help inform them. So I'm not on, obviously, like financial impacts, but for some of the different impacts, it just gave us a blanket that we didn't have to go to them for every little thing. We actually had blanket approval. So I think that was very beneficial to the organization and helped us to move forward very quickly. And our chief assessment officer would run our decisions if it was something that really would impact the councils by them, just to make sure that we were all on the same page. And they were very supportive of all the decisions that we made.
I think that I echo that. I think that was a very smart decision. We have our executive committee. We now meet with them on a weekly basis, the C-suite and our executive committee, to make sure that we all are always on the same page, so that when anything is coming out then to the board or the membership at large, we're a united front. Because we're a very traditional organization, and some of these things I think give a little anxiety about how fast you have to pivot. So that constant communication has been helpful. This is something of a financial question, and probably something we will ask all of the presenters. How has COVID impacted your forecasting for your certification program? Do you think you're going to be flat to budget? Do you think you're going to see numbers dip? Are you going to actually see an increase? Have you been able to forecast out what the impact is going to be?
So Jess and I actually wouldn't be responsible for that within the organization, but our financial team and our chief finance officer, he is actually budgeting. And we do know that we had a dip in April and May, but that we saw an increase again at the end of May towards the beginning of June. So we are starting to see some recovery there. We are definitely impacted by the limitations of having a in-person test center agreement. And so we are looking at some other alternatives like remote proctoring and things like that that would help to be able to get more seating, because there is definitely limited seating available within Pearson, and money is actually accounted at the time this exam is taken.
So Jen, I wanted to ask if perhaps John has a comment on this, and if David has a comment on this, financial continuity, or how are you handling ups and downs? John.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. The financial aspects, it was interesting timing when COVID hit our association. And we had our annual budget cycle begins, our annual fiscal year begins June 1. We were in the throes in March of preparing our budget for the next year. So in the last moments, we were able to push the pause button, regroup, hold several meetings with our budget and finance committee members, work to tweak our budget before we implemented it. The budget we started out with in early March and the budget we finally approved in mid-May, the two were vastly different. So it was just fortuitous in the timing that our planning accounted for a lot of things. How we accounted for them, we just really trimmed back management of our costs, our expenses, as well as we had to make some hard decisions about what our new content development would be in the coming year. So briefly, it was just a good timing that we were able to manage that budget. So we are predicting manage two budget in the coming year with all the conservative approach that we used with COVID-19 decisions, I guess you could say. So that's how we handled it.
Thank you. And David, for organizations that are on a calendar type of budget, I guess just finishing maybe the halfway mark, what do you advise for them?
Well, I think that the most important issue for these organizations, especially those that have lost money from meetings and educational conferences, et cetera, excuse me, is the possibility of needing to look at their financial reserves as a source of funding to carry out continuing or even modifying their existing programs. I heard someone a moment ago say we're a traditional organization, and I made a note of that because I said that's the type of organization that is often most hesitant about the idea of looking at their reserves. From my perspective, and when I work with leaders of organizations and certifying bodies, my advice to them is, this is what you have reserves for. This is exactly the type of crisis, obviously, which none of us wants to face, but the type of crisis when the reserves are there to implement, to supplement, to carry on, or even expand programs in the midst of other constructs that aren't typical for you. So I think it's a very touchy subject for governing boards. They're often leaders. I heard one leader say to me, "Oh, we're not spending the reserves while I'm in office." And I thought to myself, well, that's the wrong attitude. You ought to be thinking more about how do you sustain the organization through these difficult times. My theory is you're not running a bank. You're running a nonprofit organization. You're running a certification organization. You should invest in the programs and projects. And maybe I'll talk more about this when we get to the governance section.
Thank you, David. So Jen, back to you. What other questions have come through?
Yep, we've had a few about the COVID discussion groups, but people have been answering each other, which is lovely, about how they're moderated. So I'm going to skip over those. Here's one. Given the potential risk to content with online proctoring, how are organizations balancing the need to build and maintain their test item banks with cost cutting?
Okay. Who would like to take that one? Jessica, you and Trish talked about looking at remote proctoring. Have you gotten this far in your discussions?
I'll actually let Trish talk to that one since she's more familiar with the remote proctoring.
It's something that we actually started looking into prior to COVID-19. So it's not that we only started because of COVID-19. And we do have some of our credentials, you have to have multiple examinations before you can actually earn a certification or a credential. So we are looking at some of those programs where it's just a component that may be introduced first. I believe you asked about whether or not it reduces the cost. And
I don't know that the person means, is it reducing the cost? I think he or she is asking, recognizing that we're probably in cost cutting mode. How do you balance that with also maintaining your test item banks now that everything is online? There's a tension between those two things.
I think that would be a better question actually for somebody that's in the testing administration section, one of the vendors. But from what I understand, and I actually attended a 5-day conference on remote proctoring in the last 2 weeks, and they really spoke about that the content is relatively safe. Yes, you have the option of somebody that can have a recording device, but truthfully, if you go into a Pearson VUE test center or any other in-person test center, somebody can have one of the screws in their eyeglasses be a camera. So there's a possibility for cheating whether you're in person or remote. So I think that the exposure to the test content, there's a lot of tools that they're putting out there, and there's AI built into a lot of the systems and things like that. So they are looking for potential cheaters. And so pretty much what I understood from the webinars that I've attended, it's 50-50, half a dozen one, half a dozen the other. There's potential for cheating in both of the tools, and so it's not necessarily putting your exam content out there any more than it would be from a testing environment.
Sure.
In-person testing environment, I mean.
Great. I'm gonna make you really think. What is the process to review and change eligibility requirements that meet ANSI ISO 17024 standards?
So we haven't actually altered any of our examination requirements or our eligibility requirements. Our true belief is that the eligibility criteria all have rationale behind them as to why they're important. Now, I will say that the JRC, who is our sonography accreditation body, they have made some leniencies, I guess you would say, and the programs have to track any differences that they would have from their normal program to based on COVID, and they would have to report that to the accreditation body itself. Now, we haven't, like I said, we have not actually changed any of our eligibility criteria, therefore we haven't reported anything to ANSI, but any of the exceptions that we are making for eligibility windows, so the time that they have to take the exam, things like that, we're documenting all of that because any variation from the norm has to be reported to ANSI. So I hope that helps answer the question.
I think it does.
So Jen, I had a question for you from some of the write-in questions we received. It's kind of on this theme, so let me ask this one. How are credentialing bodies managing decisions and documentation of any extensions or provisional status implementations? Who would like to take that one?
I can take that one. So actually, it did start out as a Word document. Trish and I, just started pulling all of our thoughts together, and we are actually building it into a program called Asana, which is a project management tool. So we'll be able to track changes to any of the programs that we have, especially programming, IT programming changes, so that once all this passes, we can make sure that those changes get reverted back to what their original state was.
Okay, thanks. Jen, back to you.
We're getting towards the end, Christine. There was a follow-up, but I think Trish did a nice job of addressing this. It was for those programs that only have one exam form per year, what risks to exam questions do you see with opening up to remote proctoring? And as Trish pointed out, I mean, cheating can happen in person, online, and there have been tremendous advances in how they can monitor online exams. From if you pivot your head, your screen lights up, red, and the exam stops. And there's so many advances. I think that for those people that have one exam per year, they should feel, if they're using a reputable vendor, they should feel just as secure in using that online process.
Right.
Like you said, Trish, I don't know if you feel differently, but.
I would agree 1,000%. And I think the one thing to remember, though, is if you have one exam a year and if it's a windowed period of time, if it happened in April and you're going to a test center only, well, did any of those candidates really test? It's very unlikely. So you have to consider that as well. So there's, risks, but there's also benefits as well. So just things to think about.
I'd like to add one thing to this comment as well. So I attended the same series of webinars on remote proctoring as Trish did, and I came away learning so much. And I did some follow-up work on accreditation, and I looked at what ANSI is doing with 17,024, because they do have a requirement that you have an invigilator or a proctor be present. And so that would require that you use the platform that has visual webinars, video cams, etc. And so what ANSI has prepared is a specific application that accredited organizations will complete, submit to ANSI for review. Assessors will look at it, and then assessors will also have a practice session, a real practice session with the remote proctoring to see how it works in play. When I looked at the application that ANSI had prepared, the requirements were focusing on things like qualifications, confidentiality, exam security, reporting of irregularities, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very targeted and very focused on those particular aspects of 17,024. So if you can answer those questions, you will have addressed some of the security issues, and you may be required to do more item writing, or perhaps perform, develop a second form if your volume increases, or maybe take another look at your retake policies if your examination administration cycle changes at all. So a walkthrough of that will give you a really good idea of what it is you need to do in order to maintain accreditation and meet the requirements for remote proctoring. Now, having said that, and having a few minutes left to this session, it is Linda Anguish. I'm not seeing on my panel if we have Linda joining us, if she could put her hand up and ask Aaron to unmute her to talk about the NCCA's approach. Linda, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, and thank you, Linda.
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting us to join. And I was just going to add in that the NCCA has a program very similar to what Christine was describing for 17024. It's really focused on how does remote proctoring meet the requirements of the NCCA standards. And just like Christine was mentioning, the same way you would have to demonstrate that a test center meets those security and equivalence experience requirements, you would have to do that for live remote proctoring. So we do have an exception program in place right now for our accredited programs who wish to use live remote proctoring. And we also are currently wrapping up a pilot study, which we hope to, we're currently working on a revision process with the standards, and we hope to offer some more commentary and guidance for folks that will be moving into the remote proctoring usage in the very near future. So I agree 100% with what Christine just said. It's really a question of how well you can demonstrate meeting the standards.
Right. And of course, as everybody knows, you have to go back and also take a look at your policies, because all of your policies will be affected by these decisions as well. So it's important to remember that. So Jen, I have a few minutes left, literally, in this session. Are there any other questions?
There have been a few questions that I think Christine will save towards the end so that we can have all of the panelists respond to them on innovative things that people are doing to increase revenue. So I think if Trish and Jessica maybe have a closing comment, but otherwise our questions, we're closing out on questions in this one.
So I did see someone just put up a question about, are we doing anything to bring in new revenue? And truthfully, we are looking at some new assessments related to COVID and actually medical imaging revolving around COVID. So we are looking at some new assessments in that regard as well. I think in closing, I can just say that the one thing that I think we've really done well as an organization is we've adapted, and we are constantly changing, and we are willing to work as a group, and we have a very collaborative workspace. And so I think that's been very beneficial to getting things done and making, making changes on the fly.
Yeah, I would second that. I think that it's been a great lesson in learning how to pivot and do so with grace and patience. We're all working remotely, and an in-person meeting is so very different from virtual meetings. So patience, and yeah, just trusting in your colleagues.
And I think lastly, understanding of your team members, and making sure you're checking in and helping them to survive the situation as well.
Right. It's not just about work. You've got all kinds of family issues and things that don't have to do with work that you're dealing with as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So now we will move on to our second topic, maintenance of certification, and we will turn this over to John. So John, take it away.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks. First, I want to set a stage of where NRCA, the National Roofing Contractors Association, is in its certification programs. NRCA has been around since 1886. We're a very mature organization. It has been the home for generations of entrepreneurial craftsmen and enterprises who shelter and protect America's families and businesses and each other. Our vision is the recognition of our members as professionals and to unite the industry to that purpose. That being said, I have to go back to 2008 when we first introduced our true roofing worker certification program in the area of rooftop solar. We learned a lot of lessons. That program has proven to be a boutique, small population of workers in the workforce. But as the workforce crisis, and just about every industry has suffered a workforce crisis, as our workforce crisis emerged after the Great Recession, we recognized right away the industry as a traditional industry, we had to make a lot of changes. The beginning at the top with leadership, the new leadership team that we brought in RCA, and I say we, I talk about the leaders themselves, began on a very purposeful vision to increase the public image, a more positive image of the industry. Every hospital, every clinic, every business has to have a good roof over their head or it cannot function, period. That being said, the work of the roofing industry has changed so fast. The technologies, the new systems that have come into our market have created a huge gap in performance and skills. The workforce demographics have changed. We had a crisis that had never been experienced in our industry prior. To address that crisis, we recognized early on we had to get a standardized curriculum going, and we had to create career paths that would attract better and more robust, more interested and engaged workers into the workforce. Without that career path, we just knew we were dead in the water. Starting at the top, our new CEO started in 2017. The recognition of the need for installer certifications the discussions began in 2015. It took us 3.5 years to launch our first installer certifications at the end of 2018. So we are a relatively new certification program. Our certification program requires installers to take 2 exams. First, a computer-based exam. But the key to this is the second exam is a performance exam, a hands-on practical exam where they have to actually demonstrate they can do the work to standard. That was wrought with challenges, and the cornerstone of that program is what we call our qualified assessor program. Qualified assessors, we built the qualified assessor program to the ANSI 1100 assessment-based certificate program standards. It calibrates and orientates all of our industry assessors. Today, we're up to about 80 assessors across the country in pretty much every discipline, the major roof disciplines. And the qualified assessor program was the one that was affected the most when COVID hit back in mid-March. That credential requires an annual renewal, and the renewal requirements we knew right away had to be changed. The performance exams were all put on hold across the country with our applicants for the installers. The qualified assessors, those that we did that were very active, not all of them were as active with conducting performance exams, but the very first qualified assessors we had in the program were already reaching the end of their credential. So we knew we had to keep these folks engaged. Part of the maintenance of certification for the maintenance of the credential for the qualified assessors is that they had to be performing X number of assessments each year and maintain continuity and consistency in their scoring across all scores. So that's the approach that we had for our maintenance requirements. We realized right away they didn't have an opportunity to continue doing these performance exams because the businesses were not able to do work. Buildings were closed. They could not go and install roofs. The workers were not pursuing certification. By the way, we're very fortunate that we have not seen a decrease in our applications for new certifications. So we're very optimistic about the coming year in that regard. But getting our testing centers across the country where we have the standardized testing conditions were closed. Many of those opportunities were just vanished. The qualified assessors could not conduct the performance exams. So as it affected our governance, we have 2 certification committees that operate this program and oversee different aspects of it, one for content and one on strategy and business. The concept of how do we go about making this, the renewal requirements in almost real time, making these decisions on policy changes directed by and approved by our members. Implementing another sidebar is we had been working for a year before COVID to get our entire staff equipped to work remotely as it was. We were running out of office space in our office in Rosemont, Illinois. So our IT department and our web team did a phenomenal job equipping every staff. We have about 60 staff people right across the street from O'Hare Field. And we seamlessly moved to remote working. Our leadership immediately began remote video conferencing. It's stuff that we had been working on for a year, and our entire membership, most of our members, all of our staff it was a seamless kind of painless move for most of us. We're still working remotely. And COVID has, the blessing in this is that it has solved our office space problem. Sorry for the sidebar, but so back to maintenance of certification. Our committees became more engaged. We were holding more frequent meetings, virtual meetings. The discussions were much more engaged. And for staff to have that access to our members who are running their own businesses to give us direction in how best make the decision and implement these temporary policy changes was unprecedented. We were able, and our communications and IT team were able to get that messaging out to all of our candidates, all of our certificate holders, and as a result of that, one organization stepped up and applied for 40 of their people to become qualified assessors, because during this downtime, our qualified assessor program requires completing a series of online training modules and then passing a final proctored exam. Our staff, our manager of the certification programs, and I think she may be on this call, had worked for the last 6 months before COVID, working with our testing vendor to implement remote proctoring. We had launched our remote proctoring service the end of 2019. We were ready to go with it. It was just fortuitous, and COVID in a way has been a blessing to our certification program. It almost doubled our number of qualified assessors without skipping a beat. So that being said, the governance issues, our committee's ability, the malleability, the flexibility of our members through this time, we had been going through a lot of change in the last few years with that change in leadership. As a result, we're coming out of COVID probably in better shape than we were previously. I'm blessed and proud to be working for this organization. I've been in this industry for nearly 50 years, and to see our certification program grow and get refined during this period, we have learned so much about how to improve the service to our members to achieve that new vision that was implemented in 2017. Every one of us are touched by every one of these topics through this time. The eligibility and certification requirements, our committees are actively discussing how we're revisiting our eligibility that was established over 2 years ago. It's the dynamics of credentialing are changing as fast as our industry is, and as fast as our technologies are. So that in a nutshell is all where we are at, what we've been able to do, and how we've been coping through this time. I will say that our leadership, I would have to say, was the key. The comment earlier about traditional organizations is so true that when you have leadership that is not stuck to tradition, hangs on to those things that are valuable in tradition, but has the vision to move forward and take bold, hard decisions. Did we lose a few members? Yes, we did. I will say the sales of our education content, our membership has increased significantly, even through this time. So to that end, the key of great leadership, not being afraid to fail and be able to be flexible and make changes on the fly, that was mentioned earlier as well, is what has made our organization, brought it up to the level that it is today. So that being said, I don't know that I contributed a lot to what many of you are facing right now. I have not had to go through that stuff. I'll be very transparent. We have had the opportunity to grow our program, and I would say that COVID-19 has helped to reshape our decisions-making process our governance process, how we engage our members, how we engage our certification holders, and it's really opened the door for growth for our program into the future. So
Okay.
I hope you all can apply these concepts in ways that you can see will work for your organizations, and be glad to take any questions on that.
Thank you, John. Jen, what questions came in?
Yep. John, how did your organization resolve the in-person assessment issue for annual renewal?
That's a great question. We have some local and state affiliated roofing contractor associations under the NRCA umbrella, and working with them to have limited access with social distancing to certain testing proctors. We deliver that particular exam. It is a very heavy video-based exam because there's a lot of visual, the ability to spot errors in the exam. So our test vendor, actually, we're still working with them to figure out the programming for the unique video content that we have. So we have been delivering that exam through our own LMS, which we also just recently updated to handle that robust testing. And the proctoring for these candidates is being done on a very limited basis. And we are also building up a queue of proctors and communicating with them regularly that as soon as those testing centers are open again, I'd say we had about a month of downtime of proctoring ability. We are also, our committee is actually discussing temporarily suspending proctoring for a finite group of these people on a trial basis, a conditional basis. And that, as a matter of fact, we have that committee call coming up, I think it is July 7th. So whether that will be a great experiment for us with certain requirements that we have. I wouldn't say our own remote proctoring, but our own conditions for unproctored through our LMS. So we're discussing follow-up quality control issues, including we are implementing audits of these performance exams. We have budgeted for that, and we have the problem with that will be the ability to travel to audit those performance exams. So that's one of the quality control measures that we're considering as part of this non-proctored approach for our qualified assessors.
Jen, other questions?
This is a maintenance. John, you may be able to address it, but Chris, we ask all of our panelists to address it as well. You know, regarding CE requirements for maintenance, there are many organizations that have CE requirements, and many of those CEs are acquired from attending classes. What changes or accommodations have you had to make regarding your CE requirements because of COVID?
Jessica or Trish, would you like to start with that?
So I can jump in and then Jess can speak a little bit more. So we do, for our sonography programs, they are required to have 30 CMEs within a 3-year period. They are required to earn the CMEs depending on when their 3-year period ends by December 31st. So everybody that we audited would have already earned their CMEs. Now, we have heard from some people that actually had courses that they had scheduled for this year that they aren't able to go to anymore. So we do foresee that we're going to actually receive some additional appeals next year for this year's program. But the truth is, with sonography certification, a lot of individuals can earn those CMEs virtually as well. well. So a lot of the opportunities and a lot of the conferences have actually moved virtual. So they are still getting CME opportunities. In the beginning, we had a few questions about, a conference being canceled, but now the conferences have moved to virtual environments. And we are actually finding that a lot of people, there's a lot of additional CME opportunities being provided due to COVID. And some of the sister societies have opened up and they're not even charging the same fees and things like that. So there's a lot of free learning out there as well. So it really hasn't impacted our constituents that much yet.
Yeah, I mean, just as follow up to what Trish said, one of the ideas that came up early in discussions, obviously not necessarily for our current year CME audit, but for next year, is the possibility of maybe extending an extra year for people to get their additional CMEs. Again, just a thought that we have considered.
Thank you. And John, anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, one of our agenda topics for our upcoming meeting is very similar, extending the renewal period temporarily for qualified assessors, knowing that they will not be able to conduct required assessments during their 1 year period. We have a group coming up for renewal here in the next 4 or 5 months. We just don't know how many performance exams we'll be able to have over the next several months.
And one thing that I wanted to add too is for the organizations that are accredited, and I think just as a best practice in general when it comes to maintaining certification, when you probably already have policies on extensions. And I hope your policies stayed. If they don't, you might want to rethink them. But the length of period of time that certification is awarded for doesn't change. It just means those people have some more flexibility within that cycle to earn if they go over. You don't move the line of extending the certification deadline. So if it's 3 years, it's 3 years. You find a way to make it work if somebody needs a little more time to meet the requirements. I just wanted to put that out there. And also to note that somebody had written in a question very, very similar to this one, asking what kinds of continuing education extensions or adjustments have you made due to COVID? And I think we just answered that one. So thank you to the person who wrote in. Okay, Jen, what other questions do we have?
John, I'm gonna make this 2-part because the question really does focus on certification, but you also mentioned that your membership is up, and I think there are probably many of us curious about how your membership is up right now. So I'm gonna ask you, you're gonna make this question broader than it's originally intended, but have you done any promotions during this time to make it easier, more affordable for people to earn or maintain their certification? And then the second part to that would be, and is that why you're seeing a growth in your membership?
Sure, that's a great question. Our growth in NRCA membership began in 2018 as when we announced we were launching this certification program, bringing this level of professionalism to our industry that had never had it. The time was right. The workforce crisis was severe enough. We have committed, I think it's a total of $13 million over 7 years to build this program. We are only the 3rd year into it. That commitment was attracted to, I'm going to back up very quickly. NRCA's foundation, the Roofing Alliance, funded the first ever comprehensive demographic study of our workforce, commissioned Arizona State University's research department to conduct that survey. The results were astonishing. Through that, we saw the opportunity. We had to bring more value to the industry as the industry leaders. And we did. The thing that triggered a great deal of growth in our membership was when we announced the launch of our first certification program. So the value of certification, and I will also stress, our members insisted that our certified individuals we were able to test them that they could perform the work. They could actually do the work. They knew the value of a good psychometric computer-based exam knowledge exam, but they knew also that there are a lot of people that can pass an exam, a knowledge exam, who are not necessarily competent. Performance-based exam that we have built, the data is proving to be our face validity is so high on the performance exam side of this program that exam alone, the quality of this certification program has proven to be the biggest draw for people who want to join NRCA. And for all their workers, when they see our eligibility requirements, and then they see, we obviously do not require NRCA education, but all of our education product sales started to grow, our membership started to grow as a result of offering this vision that we brought to the industry. It's not a single thing that brought that growth. It was the strategic change and the vision of our leadership that triggered a lot of this and everything that they did. I don't know if that helps, but that's how we accomplished the growth.
And what I'm hearing is you didn't have to run any promotion, make it easier to maintain your certification.
That's correct.
Okay,
correct.
Great. Christine, that's what I'm seeing on my end from a question perspective.
I have one question for John. And I mean, it's interesting to me that your organization has sort of had a trial run at, surviving, managing during something as disruptive as, say, the Great Recession, what really affected the housing industry, for example. So given the fact that you've been through this and, every aspect of your organization seemed to have been able to change and move, give us a really good tip for this group to help them get their leadership to move forward during this. I know you got a new CEO, not everybody's going to get a new CEO. Maybe that's good, maybe that's not good. But just a real practical tip for a staff member dealing with leadership to help them understand what it takes to get through this. You've been there.
Sure. Well, I can give my personal opinion on that. I don't have any data to back it up, but I can tell you this, that when the mind shift across all aspects of our organization, when the mind shift occurred that we cannot be afraid to fail, we cannot be afraid to not risk this big investment in this credentialing program. Everything that we tried, we worked 3.5 years with half a dozen different task forces and committees to chisel this rough block of concrete into a quality program. And we made a lot of cracks when we were chiseling, let me put it that way. But through that process, I think it was the tradition, the conservative nature of most of our leaders and most of our members at the time, going back to, I've been there at the association now for 24 years. And it's not the first economic downturn that I've experienced, by the way. So if there's a simple tidbit, it would be try things, collaborate, working together, cross department. We used to operate as an association, and many of you can relate to this, in pretty deep silos. And that, when we started breaking down those silos and learning how to work together better and more efficiently in deep collaboration, leaning into each other and trusting each other, that it's okay if we make a mistake, we put aside, and we are all guilty of that, and we're all proud of what the accomplishments, and that is an incentive that incentivizes and propels an association. When you change a culture like that, The leadership change came as a result of that change. It was also just timing. Our previous CEO had been at the helm for 38 years. He was retiring. So that being said, the ability to make that change and collaborate and work across departments, I can't tell you that without the skill and the quality of our communications and website team to do what they did. We held a town hall meeting, our CEO and a couple of industry leaders, one of our attorneys, in early April in response to COVID-19. We had 3,500 people on the phone, guiding them how to access the payroll protection program, giving them practical tools. So strong communications, in real time, giving our members what they needed, combined with the quality products and services that we're bringing to them. Came through a lot of failure and a lot of trial and a lot of pain over the last few years.
Well, thank you. All right, I think this is a really good segue to the work on governance and leadership that David Kushner is going to provide for us. So, David.
Well, good morning. It's been an interesting conversation to listen to so far. I made myself a note that says that literally everything, even the practical examination and proctoring issues that have been talked about so far today, involves some type of governance issue, some impact on policies, on budgets, on leadership. And so we can focus at the more micro level for testing and certification and proctoring, but my focus is really at the level of considering how organizations are working with volunteer leaders, with their boards. John has opened a number of opportunities to talk about some of the issues that related to governance, and I'll tie those into what I'm going to mention to you. I think as I thought about this kind of conversation, I said to myself that determining when and how best to engage with volunteer leadership, whether they're committee members or the board, is essential for staff during this particular period of considerable change and stress. With the virtual format of almost every meeting, you're going to face additional challenges for how, when, why board and committee business is done. I can't tell you, and you probably share this amongst yourselves as well, I keep hearing people talk to me about virtual meeting burnout. You know, I get on a call and they'll say, this is my 8th call of the day, or I've been on the phone since early this morning. And so if we feel that way from a business perspective, our volunteer leaders also have their other jobs that they do. And in some cases in healthcare, which many of us are involved with, it's highly stressful, highly time concentrated. So I can't stress enough for us to think about how do we be considerate of all those other pressures for volunteer leaders. I think as well, the issue of boards and committee members feeling that they might need to be more engaged in the day-to-day, which I also call operational level, matters as they sort out their own views on the implications on the organization from the virus. Staff leaders in the C-suite really needs to think about, you know, creating a process for reassuring the volunteer leaders, and it sounds like many of you have already embarked on this, that their engagement at the, what I would call day-to-day level, the operations level, is really not necessary. They're involved at the policymaking level, at the guidance level, at the directional, but not so much in the operational. Because once that type of change takes place, and you've all experienced it, I'm sure, at some time when the leaders get involved in more day-to-day activities, once it's in place, it's very hard to do away with it later. A good C-suite operation will be focusing on making sure that the volunteers and the leaders are engaged and yet comfortable that the staff are really taking the lead on these kinds of activities. And you heard early in this presentation from me, Trish or Jessica, about Dale Sear from Intellios getting a blanket approval from the board in advance, in his case, the council, for making changes. That streamlined all kinds of activities for staff that allowed the organization, according to what they have said, to be incredibly adaptive and creative and flexible while being attentive to all of the certification rules and requirements. I think that was an exceptionally wise move on his part, and I'm sure the parts of other leaders across the spectrum here. Keep in mind as well in this process that board and committee leaders are coming to our work, not the work they typically do, but our work, based on what's happening in their own organization. And if they're in a stressful or tense or highly concentrated centers of power, they're going to bring that approach, that attitude to the work they do with you, unless you are attentive to it. You may have to be as flexible as many of you sound like you have been from this conversation so far. But just to keep in mind that they don't do what we do on a day-to-day basis. They work in different organizations. Their policies, their procedures, everything else impact how they think. I'm hearing this especially in relation to reopenings and the concept of reopening organizations. I can't tell you how many clients and other organizations I have talked to in the last several weeks, month, about their plans for reopening, and they are all over the map. I have not seen, there's some consistency, but every group I talk to has a new twist, new tweak, different approach to doing this. And I think that that's going to impact how these programs and policy changes and new approaches are accepted, embraced, and embodied into the organization. So as you think about the reopening process and whether you're going to continue to work remotely, easier said than or thought than said, you will have to think about how will this be perceived by our volunteers, because in their case, they may be forced to be coming back to an office and think that, well, that's what's got to happen. Whereas in your organization, as John just said, they figured out how to solve their real estate problem by allowing more people to work remotely. I also think we're going to be facing a very different world of work as things return. They're not going to return, from my perspective, to the same normal that was there in the past. And so it's going to involve the engagement of volunteers, committee leaders, board leaders, et cetera, regional leaders, in the process of considering, okay, here's what we will do to reopen. How will that affect you? And what I'm suggesting to staff is it's going to require some very thoughtful approaches on your part in advance of those conversations to assure them that things are being well managed and that they're following the appropriate policies of the organization. I touched earlier on the issue of revenue, and it's come up a few times. We heard about growth in one organization. I'm sure there are others that are seeing some growth. And I'm sure, on the other hand, that there are many organizations facing some tensions as a result of declining revenue. This is going to require from the staff the really important process of thinking through how you present and defend the economic issues that are going to either committees or boards. There needs to be very thoughtful budgeting, expectations, projections of revenue, projections of cost. because I think everything is going to be on the table as this whole process continues to unfold. And that includes the real estate issues, the technology issues, the staffing issues, the in-office issues, the travel requirements, all of these pieces, and I've just touched on a few there, all involve money. They involve money, they involve consideration, they involve approval from leadership, whether it's staff leadership or volunteer leadership. So the best thing you can do is to really make sure that you have provided the substantive information to the individuals you need to, whether it's your staff leadership, the C-suite, or the committees and boards, to help them get over their concern. The issue of the reserves, I would hope that in most organizations, that's a very last-ditch effort. I'm hoping that not many will have to be tapping into their reserves, but I do think that if in fact they are, there needs to be preparatory work done to say, if we're going to continue this particular approach, if we're going to embark on a new means for testing or proctoring or something else, or a new technology, there's going to need to be investments. And if that investment requires a fairly significant impact on the budget, may very well be a good idea to say, this is the type of thing that we should be looking at as a reserve-funded program or project or activity. And I think that's okay. I think you need to raise it carefully. As I said before, present really thorough information for them. And the more traditional organization, the more tension there will be about doing that. I'm hearing a lot of really interesting, and I love it, progressive approaches to the kind of work that you're doing. And my encouragement is continue to do that even through the financial structures that you're going to face. We've talked a lot about the operational policies, the fact that they need to be reviewed or modified or implemented for specific timeframes or regarding specific issues. Again, here, the encouragement to you is that staff needs to do a lot of preparatory work, providing detailed specifics, explaining the rationale for making changes, for whether they are going to be intermediate or permanent changes and why. Again, this comes back to the fact that you're doing this, again, through a different environment. They're not in face-to-face meetings where people can feel comfortable just having a conversation about it. They're going to be all done on a virtual meeting where there are oftentimes other interruptions and other factors. So the issue of changing policies is oftentimes very critical for boards during their deliberations. And as much information as you can provide to them in advance of the consideration of those changes, in advance of the policy shifts. And I don't really care where their changes are being made for you, whether it's at your level, leadership above you, volunteer leadership, or council. In every case, we need to be prepared to defend all suggestions and to provide consideration of the implications of a policy change. It'd be really tough to try to get something presented and have options raised that you weren't ready to answer. I'm going to move because I want to be attentive to time here to the issue of strategic assessments. Organizations in many cases, and I've heard it through these kinds of conversations and others, are really looking back on their strategic plans and beginning to consider, A, are we going to be able to carry out our strategic plan the way it was designed? B, we never thought about this when we did our strategic planning. And so now does that negatively impact the plan and how we carry it out? I think that there's going to be some need for what I call not so much strategic planning in a typical sense, but more strategic assessment, strategic deliberation. If you look at your plan and it doesn't include the kinds of things that you now know you need to have going forward, then there may be a need for the leadership, the council, the board to revisit their strategic documentation and to say, we may have had 4 pillars, might be time for a 5th, or maybe one of the 4 isn't any longer important to us as we've shifted our whole focus as a result of COVID. So I think that as you look to what you do on a day-to-day basis, I would encourage the paying attention to what the current or existing strategic plan has in place. Does your work fit within that plan, or will it require modification? And if it does require modification, then how do you go about launching the conversation or encouraging the conversation that represents what I believe is the real role of a governing body, and that is to set the stage for the future of the organization. And right now, many organizations are dealing with all the present challenges. And it may be a bit early, but I think it's always better to be early than late to considering the opportunity for strategic modification to the for the future of the organization. I think, Christine, that covers most of the topics that I wanted to touch on. I want to leave enough time for questions and for any other discussion that takes place.
Thank you, David. Great information there. Jen, what questions have come through?
Yes, and thank you, David. So thinking about your governance structure and recognizing that a lot of these policies are temporary. One of our questions was, how were these policies memorialized? Were they qualified as being temporary? Just something on a piece of paper in policies and procedures. Any insights there?
Well, that's an excellent question, because it's a complicated question and response. And there are always, we all have all kinds of policies in the organization. Most of the time we refer to them, sometimes they're ignored. And so making changes to already existing policies is oftentimes complex. I think if they're temporary policy changes to accommodate COVID, then that ought to be designated as such. This is a temporary policy change. We would like approval to go forward. We anticipate, that's a critical word, that this will be in place for the next 2 months, 6 months, whatever time frame. But we do have to have a plan for revisiting it during that period of time, because we may need to extend it. If it is in fact a policy change, even temporary, that is going to impact or affect the previously in place policy, you need to refer to that. This will change policy XYZ for this temporary period, or this is a complete a suggestion for a complete change in that policy. And I think they have to be documented, and at some point then would need approval from whichever governing body manages the policy process.
Okay. I'm assuming that this question is for you, David, because I think it's a great one. Would you speak more regarding strategic assessments? And I'm assuming that's when you're looking at your pillar, what's important to your documented as being important to your organization. Now that we're in the middle of a crisis, how do you do some of that strategic assessment around it?
Yeah, it's interesting because most organizations look at their strategic plan as pretty much, okay, we've gone through that whole process, we finished, we approved it, it's in place, and this is going to guide us for the next, I don't know, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And so people have this sort of sense of accomplishment. They also have that sense of, whew, it's over. Let's get back to doing what we normally do. So I think the idea of reopening it for some groups will be challenging. So I think that there's a need, and I'm not sure how it will take place within each organization, but if in fact your particular group, whether it's the certification group or the testing processes or whatever that you're doing, looking at the current strategic plan and determining whether in fact there are areas that need to be changed or added, I think that needs to be documented carefully, thought through, and then presented through the typical, what I would say, chain of communication within the organization, through the leadership on the staff, to see if in fact they're comfortable with it, their willingness to share it with the strategic previous or current strategic planning committee or council. And I would just be careful here that there's no need to feel like you're changing the complete strategic plan. Because if people feel that that's what's happening, that's going to get more pushback. I think you need to be very careful, focus in on areas that were not touched on or that need to be revised, and focus your attention there. And so that's why I call it a strategic assessment. It's sort of, in some cases, like scenario planning for changes, and that is, all right, here's what we think is going to happen for us. Here's the scenario. What do you think? How will it affect us? Should we, in fact, embed it into a more formal plan?
You know, one of the things we've talked a lot about in our organization in the past year is access to education, right? What are the barriers that are up? And we really think about it, I think, from a monetary perspective. In the past 3 months have really forced us to rethink what access means. Similar to schools that have gone virtual, not everyone has the same access to Wi-Fi or, you know, good quality computer technology. And so what does that mean as we're trying to serve a broad swath of people? What does that access look like? I think is probably something that should be a strategic priority for all organizations.
Yeah, and as we look through all the protests and all the changes that are they're coming around in our country, I think that many organizations are going to need to do a strategic assessment to say, how does this fit in with what we do? What strategic focus, mission focus, maybe vision focus have we not considered in the past that we are now being awakened to, and that we should be considering?
May I add something to this too? And I think it gets to one of the questions that was written in that says, what kinds of promotions, if any, is your organization running during this time to make it easier, more affordable, et cetera, for someone to earn or maintain their certification? And that hits right there. You know, I think looking at accessibility is critical. For example, as I've been learning more about remote proctoring, if you're offering your exam to somebody at home and they live in an area where internet is not stable, you know, what kind of policies do you have that will help them gear up to the right technology so they're not discriminated against because they don't have it or they don't have access to it? I think we really have to think beyond perhaps some of our stricter, more template types of policies that worked pre-COVID to this, because if you look at some of the changes going on right now within our country, I think there are so many opportunities for people who've lost their jobs, whose industry is not going to come back, like hospitality. I mean, Hyatt and Hilton just made announcements. The airlines are gearing down. What were now furloughed jobs are becoming no job. And I think to go to one of the questions, what do you do? What else can you do to make your program attractive, is look to see if your industry or profession dovetails with any other, and if you can step in or partner and step in and provide some tool that will help individuals get the skills they need. It doesn't have to be full scope certifications. It could be training if you have a training arm like John's organization does. It could be micro credentials. If you're looking at a specific skill set, I think there are a lot of opportunities. And if you look at the new generation, the Gen Zs coming through, what do you have that's going to be attractive to them? And what's the best way of getting it to them? It's not going to be more than likely your traditional certification. Now, having said that, I want to point out that traditional certification served an incredibly important purpose. You've got to go to mission. And if that's the vehicle, the mechanism, stick with it. But if you have other opportunities that you can build on, I think now's a really good time, because people will have the time to go earn it. If you can make it attractive and affordable, you will gain back in value. You will gain back in the understanding and the commitment that people see for you being a nice organization to reach out for them. There will be some good social capital that is so important right now that you can gain from. And I would really urge you to, think about how your organization can step into these positions. And that will be, I think, something that can be very much staff-driven, staff-led, and then guided through some important governance kinds of conversations, maybe the kind of pillar that needs to be established for certain types of organizations. So I just wanted to add that to the mix and make sure I got that question out there. So if anybody else has, and this can also have a good impact on your budget too, on your bottom line. So if anybody else would like to comment along those lines so we can answer these questions, please, I open it up.
Christine, this is David. If I can make a very brief follow up to that. I think what you just explained is a perfect example of a strategic assessment. And that's what I would encourage organizations to take the time to do, that kind of strategic deliberation and assessment based on exactly what you're talking about, to see how our own organization fits into the milieu that you were just laying out. Thank you.
Okay, Jen, other questions?
Yep, I'm going to start with David, and I think this is something that we would want all of our panelists to weigh in on. Whose organizations already had a disaster plan, policy, or strategy in place prior to COVID? And if you did, how is it held up compared to reality? And if you didn't, are you planning to create one for future use?
If you're looking, this is David, if that's the question to me, I have not come across an organization that I'm familiar with that has told me that they've had a disaster plan. I mean, in most cases, they have a plan for a fire in the building or something along that line. But for something like this is just so far off the radar screen for most people that I'd be surprised if there was a plan that fit this situation with COVID-19. I do think that this will be forcing back to the governance issues and the leadership issues and the strategic thinking, more focus on how would we deal with something like this again in the future, because now we have all been introduced to the possibility this could reoccur, not just 19, but other viruses, and that we are quite vulnerable, that we never really thought about, most of us. So I think this is again back at that high level governance, volunteer leadership, even committee leadership, committee members thinking, what would we do? What should we do in the future if something like this occurs again?
Jessica or Tricia?
So we have, I don't know if you would call it a disaster management strategy, but we do have like an incident management strategy. So if an incident occurs, now, of course, we weren't thinking along the lines of COVID-19 or anything that broad. So I think that we do have like a communications plan. We have like, it talks about bringing a small group together and those that need to know, and, developing, there's like bullet points that you have to kind of follow. And so we do have a strategy, and it does change depending on what the incident itself is. So there is a plan of action, I guess you could say. And I do think in one of the many webinars that I've attended, you can't plan for everything. So, now we are learning to plan more for like a pandemic. But, if all of a sudden the internet went down, has anybody planned for that? I don't think so. We wouldn't be having this meeting. So, there are things that you can't always anticipate or have a solution for, but you do have to have a plan in place, like how you would react, and maybe have some backup plans. I know the person that was actually speaking works down in DC, and she was actually talking about, the bunker with the secret phone and, different communication plans. So, they're obviously in the government and very high level, so very different, but I don't think anyone can plan to that level, not for everything, I would say, but we do have a incident management process, I guess you could say.
Okay, and John.
Sure, I'll speak to how NRCA approaches this. I want to say 10 years ago, we started discussing internally as staff disaster response for our members. One of our senior staff pursued his MBA at Northwestern Kellogg School of Business and brought a lot of that information back to us. And as it turned out, we created products for our members, training content and videos and whatnot on disaster response and how to manage that. And through that, we realized, this, from an internal staff perspective, we hadn't really thought about it. We hadn't even thought about duty of care issues with our staff. So that being said, that put us on a path of completely, we realized, I mentioned earlier, the silo effect that we suffered from. Our leadership saw the need for a lot of change. What we learned, we engaged Kellogg on a pursuit of completely changing how we went about our strategic planning and converted our every 3 to 5 year strategic planning process into a living, breathing, dynamic process. Through that process, it impacted the culture internally and with our members to such a degree that all that we had learned when we created the disaster response products for our members, we incorporated it into different aspects of our strategic plan and vision. That gave us the flexibility to speedily and immediately respond to crisis situations. The fact that we were converting all of our staff to remote working anyway was part of that plan. We had no idea that COVID would hit and we would need and depend on that. So it's not a silver bullet for having a disaster response plan. It is a cultural change, in my opinion, a strategic thinking approach of how your organization functions and its culture. A lot of we're evolving as an organization. We've been around a long time. We have a lot of experience, and bringing in the experts from Kellogg to help guide us through that strategic plan, the changing in how we did our strategic planning, made a huge difference in how it shifted the culture of our entire organization, gave us the flexibility to be able to respond and be prepared in the event of a change. As David said, no one could predict. Yep. Christine, as you said, you just don't know what you're going to get hit with. And Trish, same thing. But when the more flexible and the more collaborative your organization is, its ability to communicate immediately and work with its leaders, its volunteer leaders, I'd say that's where the big payoff came. And it's been a process, and it was a lot of growing pains for us as well. Some staff didn't like it and they left. The change in leadership, as many organizations have experienced, some staff didn't like that and they left. But it's a growing pain. So that's how we handle it. Our history of how we arrived at this point and how we were able to emerge from this crisis, if you will.
Thank you, everybody. So Jen, we're close to wrapping up. Is there another question in there we can tackle?
There's one more, and I think it's an interesting question for the panel. We struggle with this internally as well. Are any of you marketing your credentialing programs focusing on the value prop of validating applicants resilient to crises? Several of our certification programs include business continuity or disaster preparedness within exam topic specifications. So there is actual relevance there. But the person asking the question says, I'm concerned that it may be too soon to focus on that without seeming insensitive to the real tragedies that are being experienced due to the pandemic. Any thoughts?
Let's see, David, let's look to you to have this answer. It's interesting.
Yeah. It's this whole disaster preparedness piece for me is interesting because one of my clients has been dealing with the issue of disaster preparedness if the electric grid goes down. And that to me is something we've never, we've talked about COVID, we've all had access, we do webinars, and some days I sit here and say to myself, if their concerns about the grid were in fact to happen, then we would have none of this contact. And, so what would we do? So the issue of disaster preparedness is something that has just been running through my mind based on access to information about a different approach. I think we need to be careful. There's this last sentence, and I can only read the top part of it. It says, seeming insensitive to the real tragedies. We have to be sensitive to those real tragedies. And yet at the same time, we just can't wait. There's no specific time. You can't wait. If we wait 3 months or 6 months, it's going to be better. I think we're all facing the fact that what do we do at the end of this year if there's a major resurgence? We can't wait that 3 months. The 3 months might be now. And that's when I'm coming back to the issue of strategic assessment of where you are today and how do you bring in new revenue? How do you deal with changing policies? How do you deal with a longer term disaster plan? And I think that these are all practically important questions that need to be looked at in the middle of also looking at making all the other changes that Trish and Christine and others talked about. And to me, this is the focus at the top of the governance leadership pyramid, if you will, for any organization. That's what that top group should be thinking about.
1 minute. Words of wisdom, John.
I can share with you in 1 minute what we did about 3 or 4 years ago as part of our leadership training during our annual mid-year meetings. We actually had a couple of staff people who were more removed from the meetings show up. We had a camera and we had a microphone, and we did a little role play with our members, and they did not know it. We were a little nervous about this, but it worked charmingly. We walked up to them as though they were news reporters, press, put a microphone and turn on the lights and camera and say, hey, we just heard your company in Santa Barbara, California, they had this major fire that your crew started, and they froze. Did not know how to respond. We did that in partnership with our marketing department and used those sound bites and those video clips as part of our training content. And as far as our promotion, don't you be caught like this. We took a little risk because of upsetting our members when we did it, but afterwards they were all in on it, and it really worked.
Attention.
That's something that got their attention, and it worked. The importance of knowing how to respond, that flexibility and just having confidence that, we'll get through this, we'll deal with it responsibly and transparently with our members and the public, and it worked very well.
Reminds me of some of the comments I've heard all morning is don't be afraid to try something and fail. So Trish and Jessica, any 1 minute, because we're at the wire here.
I don't actually think we have anything significant to add. I think John and David did a great job answering that question.
Well, thank you to our panelists and Jen for facilitating the questions. I would like to now turn this back to Erin. She has a few informational slides for us.
I would like to actually, let me go the right way. I would like to introduce Gail, who's going to, from the CNG board, who is going to speak a little bit about possibly getting involved. And Gail, you can go ahead and speak. I just unmuted you.
Hi, everybody. This has been a great meeting. Thank you all for the presenters. a lot of you guys are already involved in CNG just by coming to our meetings, but we have openings on both our board and our program steering committee. So those are the folks that create or plan the meetings like you're in right now. I know it's our first virtual, usually they're face-to-face, but I think going forward, we may be considering doing this more often, not only for the during the pandemic, but because we can invite people who may not be in the Chicago or DC area, which is where we have our two meetings throughout the year. So if you go to the certificationnetworkgroup.org website, you will find some applications for both our board and our steering committees. We would love to have you guys all consider it, and there's a lot of great networking in all of the teams, the three teams. Lots of really great people. So come on, join in with us. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Gail. One additional thing is we will be having a meeting. The Chicago chapter will be having a meeting. We are still determining the date. It will be virtual. However, I think it's going to be September 16th, possibly. I do know the CNG DC chapter is doing something too, so keep an eye out for that. That'll also be virtual. I want to thank everyone, and also if you didn't have any questions answered, I would encourage you to go over to the CNG LinkedIn page and possibly start a chat over there. I know that with the changing days that we're living in, it's minute by minute. So that's a good way to reach out to other colleagues and possibly see what other people are doing and get some advice. But I want to thank all of our sponsors. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank Christine. And I want to thank all of you for attending our first ever virtual meeting. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or anyone involved. And as Gail said, it's a great opportunity to get involved and meet new people. So thank you everyone for attending. And again, this will be recorded. This was recorded and we will have it up on the CNG website within 48 hours. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Erin.
Bye.
Bye.